Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 6392. This is the first step in the Trump agenda to deregulate Wall Street, despite candidate Trump's pledges to hold elite bankers accountable. In fact, as we debate this bill today, Trump Tower's revolving door is spinning with Wall Street insiders. Yes, in a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, Trump and his transition team are plotting their agenda to weaken financial reform and bring us back to the pre-crisis Wild West days, when banks could gamble with taxpayer money. Bank stocks are up on news of gifts to come, and newspaper headlines are already documenting Republicans' aggressive plans. In fact, President-elect Trump just announced that he will nominate Steven Mnuchin, a former Goldman Sachs executive who now sits on the board of the mega bank CIT, to be his Treasury Secretary. Mr. Mnuchin's bank is just one of 27 banks that stands to benefit directly from this legislation. Though CIT crashed, that's the bank, and went bankrupt during the crisis because of high-risk commercial lending and subprime loans, somehow Mr. Mnuchin still managed to sign an employment deal handing him $4 million a year in 2016. I suppose passing this legislation is just the Republican Congress's way of giving him a signing bonus for coming into government. We enacted Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in response to the stunning greed and regulatory failures of our financial system. And yet, with this bill, the Republicans are displaying a staggering degree of historical amnesia. This bill is the epitome of that dangerous agenda, with H.R. 6392 gutting our banking regulators' oversight of $4.5 trillion in banking assets, or approximately 30% of the industry currently subject to enhanced rules. Make no mistake, this bill is not about helping the community banks, because 99% of our country's community banks and credit unions are already exempt from most rules in Dodd-Frank. So I don't want anybody to come out here saying, oh, we're helping the community banks. This has nothing to do with the community banks. This is about deregulating the big banks over $50 billion. It is also not about tailoring regulations for regional banks. Wall Street reform already required that, and the Federal Reserve is already taking steps to do so. No, this bill is about a wholesale regulatory exemption for just 27 of the biggest banks in America. Banks with $100, $200, and even $400 billion in assets. Many of the types of banks that would benefit from this bill failed spectacularly during the financial crisis. In fact, large bank holding companies with more than $50 billion in assets received twice as much bailout money per dollar than banks with less than $50 billion in assets. And contrary to the talking points from the other side of the aisle, these mega regional banks are not just big community banks, no. These regional banks are some of the worst players in predatory, subprime lending leading up to the financial crisis. They have preyed on minority communities and rural communities, and they have passed the buck on to taxpayers when their bets fail. Remember Countrywide? Remember Countrywide, a $200 billion thrift? They were the #3 subprime mortgage originator and #1 issuer of subprime mortgage bonds in 2006. They are a poster child of the crisis. Remember Washington Mutual? with $300 billion in assets, whose hometown paper, the Seattle Times, described as predatory. Remember Wachovia, with their exotic pick-a-payment mortgage loans. Remember in October of 2008, when they posted a $24 billion quarterly loss, and the FDIC had to facilitate a midnight acquisition by Wells Fargo. Remember New Century, or AmeriQuest, or Option One? This bill would enable more blowups like these. H.R. 6392 would repeal Dodd-Frank's $50 billion threshold, above which banks are subject to closer regulatory scrutiny, and prevent the Federal Reserve Board from regulating these banks. Instead, it would hand over that responsibility to what is known as FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, in order, they say, to regulate the banks. The FSOC would have to go through a Byzantine and litigious process of designation, which takes 2 to 4 years to complete. Oh, this would give them plenty time to go back to the old ways that Dodd-Frank is trying to prevent. Even if a potential Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin, decided to regulate his former employer, by the time he got around to it, the damage would likely already be done. It's also significant to note that Republicans have repeatedly tried to dismantle the FSOC and its existing designation authority for large non-banks. They have called the council unconstitutional, introduced bills to make it harder for the FSOC to do its job, and help companies like MetLife fight its designation in court. What's more, Chairman Henselin's sweeping Wall Street deregulation bill, the Wrong Choice Act, would repeal this exact same designation authority altogether. Why is the majority even considering this bill today, when the chairman's Wall Street reform repeal package would render this bill moot? It is clear that this is just the first act in a long, dangerous play that will continue well into next year. I therefore urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this harmful bill. Members of Congress, as I said when I took the floor to debate this bill, this is the first act in Trump's promise that he's going to deregulate, his promise that he's going to get rid of Dodd-Frank, his promise that he's going to get rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, his promise that he's going to, in essence, turn all of this back over to Wall Street. I reserve the balance of my time.